Welcome back. And now let's get the show started. On Monday, last Monday, that is, the president announced the gradual easing of the lockdown in the Federal Capital Territory, in Lagos, the commercial capital of the nation, and in Ogun State. According to the president, the decision to ease the lockdown is based on the impact that the lockdown is having on the economy. The guidelines for easing the lockdown have been given by the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19. But the question is, how effective will this be in curbing the spread of the virus? Of course, if you followed the briefing yesterday, you will know that the numbers are getting higher and higher. In fact, yesterday there were 238, I think, 238 new cases reported by the NCDC and the Presidential Task Force. Well, to look at this easing with us this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tunji Funsho, a physician and cardiologist who will be joining us via Skype from Lekki. Good morning, Dr. Funsho.
Morning.
Igariwe Enwo, who's a member of the House of Representatives representing Afikpo, North-South constituency of Ebonyi State. Good morning. He joins us from our studio in Abuja. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Let me begin with the medical doctor, the cardiologist. Dr. Funsho, what is your take on this gradual easing of the lockdown?
I didn't hear the last part of your question.
I said, what is your take on the easing of the lockdown at this time?
Well, I'm coming from the perspective of also having been involved in public health as the chairman of the National Polio Plus Committee, which is charged with polio eradication. I think whatever decision we're taking in public health, we always take into consideration the public and their perception of whatever intervention we are about, to engage in, which involves them. If there's no buy-in from the public, there is no public health intervention that can be successful. I believe that the gradual, I think we must emphasize that. That it's not just a total lift and everybody can do as they like. I believe it's a phased, lifting of the ban. And what we all need to understand is that the public are going to have to play a very major role in ensuring its success. It's impossible to continue in the state we are in an environment where we don't have any social security, and about 60% of our GDP, the economists tell us, comes from the informal sector. So it's a gradual lockdown, lifting, but we all need to find a way of communicating with the public who are the recipient of this intervention to make them appreciate why we're doing what we're doing. If I give you an example of our challenges with the polio eradication efforts, which Rotary, my organization, was involved with, you can imagine a situation where you are bringing vaccines free of charge to people to protect their children against being paralyzed by polio. And they say, no, we don't want it for different and various reasons. And then we knew we needed to communicate with them to understand the need for it to be done and the gravity of refusing, to the point that we had to recruit polio survivors to follow us to those kind of areas to show families the consequence of not having had the polio vaccine. So we need to get the public involved in something that involves them and their daily lives. And we need to evolve communication tools that will make them have a buy-in so that they do this voluntarily. So I think it's a timely thing if properly managed.
But some people are saying that this is the wrong time to ease it because the figures are rising.
Well, the figures are rising. They will be rising in some parts, and they will be plateauing. If anything, the figures in the last few days for Lagos, that was the epicenter before, is to go by. There may be, some light at the end of the tunnel because the numbers for Lagos is stable or decreasing, whilst in other parts, like Kano, it is galloping. That is to be expected. And I believe that we are using tactics in our environment that I'm sure our specialists in this field have weighed, very, very strongly before, coming to this decision. And we just need to ensure that people buy into it because this is a public health intervention. It will not succeed until the public buys into it. We must evolve tools and modalities to get their voluntary buy-in. I need to stress this. We also need to ramp up our testing because that will give us some level of comfort that we are not underestimating the ravages of the disease in our community. And as far as that is concerned, we still have a very, very, very long way to go.
Okay, Representative Anwar, let me bring this to you. I mean, the cardiologist has talked about getting the buy-in of the people. The president in his statement said it's because based on the impact of the lockdown on the economy. In other words, it's impacting the people in a way that's not too good. But do you think it's the right time?
Well, lifting the lockdown presupposes that government or the authorities have a better understanding of this novel virus. That's the first thing, because, like you know, it's a novel virus. It has taken time for government all over the world, not just here in Nigeria, to understand the fundamentals of this virus. So having understood some aspects of how this virus transmits, for example, which necessitated a lockdown, I think it's actually time, considering that there's no way actually we can go ahead on that lockdown. The country has to move on, but responsibly. Again, it's important to also emphasize that when we ease the lockdown, it doesn't mean the problem is over. It doesn't mean the pandemic is gone. It doesn't mean we must go back to our old ways. Through education, which we have seen, we basically understand the protocols of how to live our lives within this pandemic. So I think it is a good enough time. People have understood what they should do. They have understood the need for social distancing. They understand what it means to keep to basic hygienes. So I think it is, so that the country doesn't collapse, it is a good enough time to start a gradual easing. But just like the cardiologist said, it also means that the citizens also have to know that the problem is not over and that they should still follow the protocol which we have all been told about.
Okay, Mr. Anwar, we'll just hold your thoughts. We'll take a moment and we'll come back to continue. We'll pick it up from that point where the citizens need to understand, and then how does it tie in with the laws that are backing this quarantine process across the country. We'll be back in a moment. Please stay with us.
COVID-19.
Thank you for staying with us. We still have our guest in the house, Dr. Tunji Funshaw, a physician cardiologist, who is joining us from Lekki in Lagos via Skype, and Mr. Igariwe Enwo, member of the House of Representatives in our Abuja studio. Well, Mr. Enwo, you were the one that was talking before we went on that break, and you were talking about the need for the people to understand that it is not over yet. The other side of it is, some are wondering, how is it that we're even carrying on this lockdown process? Is there a law backing it? Or are we still using the 1925 or 1920 thereabout Quarantine Act, 1926, yes?
Yes, basically, when the president made the first proclamation about this disease, he was still relying on the very archaic 1926 Quarantine Act, which is part of now our received English law. It's contained in the laws of the Federation 2004. But this is basically the Quarantine Act, which our colonial masters bequeathed on us in 1926, like you rightly pointed out. But right now, what the House has tried to do through the very proactive intervention of the leadership is to introduce a new regime, a new law that will strengthen what we have as a quarantine law or an infectious diseases law, which is what the House started last Tuesday in the form of a bill which was sponsored by the Right Honorable Speaker Femi Gbajabiamila and the chairman of the two committees on health. So as we speak now, there is an attempt to introduce a new law which will give a strong framework, a structure towards this country being like other responsible countries in the world, having a robust infectious diseases act. As I must state here, we are trying to do catch up. This is something this country ought to have done a long time ago. But like the Chinese say, saying that the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best time is now. It is good that we're even doing it now, but this is something we ought to have done. We are just trying to do catch up. We were more or less caught pants down that this country didn't have something you will call a modern infectious diseases law. So right now we are trying to introduce one through this bill, which is called the Infectious Diseases Act, which if you just give me, because a lot of people have heard a lot of comments on this bill. A lot of people don't even know what it is called. This is, let me read the long title of this proposed bill. It's a bill for an act to repeal the Quarantine Act, Cap Q2, Laws of the Federation of Nigeria 2004, and enact the Control of Infectious Diseases Bill, make provisions relating to quarantine, and make regulations for preventing the introduction into and spread in Nigeria of dangerous infectious diseases and for related matters. So what this bill tries to do is to retool our infectious diseases law to make it fit for purpose, because what we have now is something that was done in 1926. As at the time it was done, it could only capture a few infectious diseases such as smallpox, plague, and cholera. There was nothing like coronavirus then. There was nothing like SARS, which these are modern afflictions that are coming now. So what we have now, as at the time corona methods, we had nothing at all by way of law which this country could fall back on to say, yes, we are prepared for this. So I think that is what this parliament, this ninth assembly, is trying to do.
But in doing that, how relatable is it? Yes, the 1926 Act talks about 200 naira for a fine for those who are violating. I mean, we talked about when we were opening a man who traveled from Lagos within a lockdown when he's not supposed to travel from Lagos to the southeastern part of the country. And then he gets there to test positive to the coronavirus. Now, if we're going to go by the old law, he will just be paying a fine of 200 naira. And now with this new law which has come in, the fine's going to be higher. I mean, people can be arrested for violating or deliberately moving to spread such diseases that they should not be spreading. But is there an understanding amongst the people? Because even the lockdown, there's still that thing of we don't understand, we are hungry, and then there's a need to enforce laws within a sphere of understanding of the people so that they can relate with it. So are the people being carried along in this conversation?
Well, like I said, we are even trying to do catch-up as far as this legislation, this piece of legislation is concerned. As we stand now, even the lockdown can be challenged on several grounds. So many things that we are doing, even the quarantine we are doing, virtually everything we are doing concerning this pandemic now is we are just trying to catch up, like I said. So as it stands now, part of what we do in Parliament, our basic duty in Parliament, is lawmaking. When we are making laws, we either try to amend existing laws or repeal existing laws or introduce a brand new legislation. So in this case, we are trying to repeal what is already there, which is not good enough. We are just trying to bring our country up to speed so that we are like other countries. Like you rightly said, law is supposed to serve as deterrent against maybe wrongdoing in society. So like you stated, right now, the penalty, for example, for any violation, the highest you can pay is 200 naira, which you know for today is not enough deterrent. It doesn't deter enough if you know that if you break lockdown, you're only going to pay 200 naira. So what we are trying to do now is, as much as possible, articulate legislation that is fit for present-day Nigeria. Well, when you talk about carrying Nigerians along, I agree entirely. Lawmaking is a process. It's not something we just wake up in a day and we come up with what we call law. We run a bicameral parliament. What we have introduced now, what we have started now in the House of Representatives, must definitely go to the Senate. At the end of the day, the Senate will also concur with the House. It takes a process. It's not something, it's not a one-day thing, it's not sprint. It starts and ends with the presidency assenting. That's what Section 58 of our Constitution tells us. So it's not something we just start and we end in a day. Mind you that we are supposed to be representatives of the people. What we do is we represent the very best interest of our constituents, and that's Nigeria. We don't make laws for individuals. We don't make laws for our own interest. We make laws for the interest of the country. So as representatives of the people, it is our duty to make sure what we do is in the best interest of the people. Now, under normal circumstances, we do first reading, we do second reading, we send to the committees. The committees will do public hearing. All these things are to have buy-in of the general public so that what is done in the best interest, takes professional input and all that and all that.
Okay, Mr. Enwo, can you just hold your thoughts? We'll get back to you. Let's just come into Lagos here and look at the health implications of all of this. We have joining us in our Lagos studio, Dr. Billy Usani, who's a public health physician. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
So you're aware that the lockdown's going to be gradually relaxed from Monday.
Yes.
But before then, what did you observe in terms of the people and how the total lockdown impacted them?
Well, I would say that this was more like a shocker. It was like a bomb, dropping a bomb on the population. So the lockdown came suddenly. People were not really prepared for the lockdown, and everybody just needed to adapt and adjust to that sudden lockdown. You know, ordinarily, I heard a security expert speaking on one of your programs early on, a couple of days back. He was saying that under normal circumstances, if you wanted to initiate a lockdown for this kind of pandemic, you needed to do it in phases, you understand? But he said we just moved from 0 to level 4, you know, to level 4 lockdown and all of that. So a lot of people were taken unawares. People were not prepared. People were not ready and all of that. And we know the kind of population we have. A lot of people are living below the socioeconomic bar, you understand? And a lot of people, livelihoods are on a daily basis and all of that stuff like that. So the sudden lockdown actually impacted the people. So the consequences or their response or their reaction to the lockdown would not have been ideal under normal circumstances because there were so many issues and factors you had to contend with. So even though they tried to do the enforcement, but of course, when people are hungry, people's livelihoods are threatened, they are, you know, you understand? So they're going to react in a different way, you know, based on all of those factors involved.
Okay, Dr. Funshaw, let me bring this to you. The effecting of that lockdown, yes, we're easing it from Monday, but when you were talking, you talked about even when you were doing the battle against polio and all that, you bring vaccines to people and they're telling you, no, based on their leanings or understandings of the situation, as it were. You also suggested carrying the people along and making it gradual. Even at that time when it was a total lockdown, there were still a lot of people out on the road that were not supposed to be out there. And now that the news has even come out that it's going to be eased gradually, the numbers of infections appear to be increasing by the day. So how do we manage the situation?
The normal trend of this pandemic is that at the time you lock down and you already have community spread of the disease, it is going to increase exponentially until you get to the point that those who are already infected, that have infected other people, are going to manifest. As you know, it takes about 14 days. At the very, very utmost, very rarely, it may even extend up to 24 days. So you will expect that for some time, at least in our own case, for some time, at least in the next 2 weeks, the figures may keep increasing, particularly in those areas that didn't have total lockdown. Don't forget the numbers we are looking at is the aggregate number for the whole country. It does not reflect what is happening in every state. Some states have remained stagnant in the number of cases. As I mentioned earlier, that of Lagos actually, has shown a decrease in the last 3-4 days. So even if we continue the lockdown for another couple of weeks, we're still having to get the effect of those people who have previously been infected manifesting. So before we come to a conclusion, particularly for something like this pandemic, we'll get to the end of it. Until we get to the end of this pandemic, we'll really never truly know whether any of the interventions that have been initiated have been partially successful, fully successful, or a failure. But as it is right now, I am not surprised at the figures, because if you look at the trend elsewhere in the world, even with lockdowns still existing, they're still having increases. I mean, New York is a case in point. While they were in lockdown for about 2 weeks, the numbers were still rising. It's only in the last 1 week or so that they reached a plateau. And that is just reflection of the people who already have been infected, are asymptomatic, and have now started manifesting the disease. I'm confident that if everybody plays their part, and particularly the public, because there's a limit to which laws can make people behave themselves. And like I said earlier, in public health issues, it is most important for you to get the public buy-in. You cannot enforce a law that the public does not want to obey. Our police force is barely 400,000, I believe. It is far, far, far too few to police every nook and cranny of this country. So we must ensure, like the legislator said, we must ensure the buy-in of the people through, like we did with polio, through the interventions by religious leaders, traditional leaders, and people who are at the local level, our opinion leaders. I think we should use the next few weeks in buy-in comes into force.
Doctor, you spoke earlier about the easing and then us following the recommended protocols, like washing of hands, using sanitizers, wearing of masks will become compulsory as from Monday. But I want to look at the washing of hands. This has been, I think it was the first item that was given to us as one of the ways to prevent the infection. But I have not heard, I don't know about you, of any states talking about the provision of water, making the provision of water a major item that has to be dealt with to ensure that the people do have running water to wash their hands.
That question brings to point some of the pitfalls in our approach generally. The government is doing their bit, but we've come to a stage where we should now call our SWAT team together. In other words, get a team of people together who will look at our strengths, our weaknesses, the opportunities inherent with what we're doing currently, and the threats to the program that we're having now. That will bring up this issue that you mentioned, the issue of provision of water. Unfortunately, provision of water is not something that you can do in the short term. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of appropriation for funds. And to put up one, in our experience, takes about 3 to 4 weeks. From planning to completion of some of the solar boreholes we made, it takes about 2 months. So that will not serve us in the short term. I think we can appeal to people in different localities who can help, and some have been doing so, to provide communities with potable water in any form they can. It is very important for the government now to use this opportunity to build for the future, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. We're not even certain from the predictions of our public health officials and epidemiologists that we're not going to have a second wave of this pandemic, the way things are going. So provision of water is very important. Provision of basic sanitation is also important. One thing is to talk about water, but also to talk about the environmental hygiene that leads to easy contamination. So that is my take on that. If we do a SWOT analysis, we'll be able to look at the ways where we strengthen and invest in areas we have strengths that will give a boost to what we're doing. But then we need to look at our weaknesses and start to plan, to make sure that, we strengthen those areas we're weak. And then, again, there are opportunities.
Dr. Funshaw, can you just hold your thought? When we come back from this break, we'll take a look at the other protocols which have been recommended. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. Yes, Dr. Sani, so as from Monday, we expect, from what has been said, that 200 million masks will be in use as from Monday. I mean, how possible is that?
It's
well,
more
as if they're not in use. Anybody who wants to step out of their house must have, let's say, 100 million.
100 million, yeah. So that's a big challenge for us, and that's what the government should be looking at. What are the social mechanisms that are in place to assist people? Because masks cost money. A standard surgical face mask can't be anything less than 300 or 350.
No, they say we should not use surgical masks.
Well,
so as not
I'm
to
just
deprive you guys of what you need.
Yes, but I'm just giving an example of the cost implication of having those masks. But then if you're going to use a mask, you need to use something that is at least protective to an extent. The cloth masks have a very low level of protection in terms of, but they say just have a face covering so that you can protect other people in case you're asymptomatic and you have the virus and you can transmit to other people. So facial covering, so people can do homemade masks. They can use any fabric, any appropriate fabric to create a do-it-yourself mask and use. So these are options that people can explore. But it would have been a better scenario if the government is trying to suggest that everybody comes out with masks. There should be some kind of social arrangement, socio-economic arrangement in place to assist people, you understand, to actually get those masks, to make sure that the compliance levels are high, because otherwise it will still be a challenge. You will find people who would come out because they will tell you, oh, I can't afford a mask, or I'm not able to make one for myself.
But those cloth masks are really one use, one wash, right?
Yes, one use, one wash.
Once wash, and then iron if you can before you use it again.
So you have to disinfect them. So ironing is a very good way of disinfecting them because viruses are sensitive to heat. So once you wash in detergent, rinse properly, and then iron them, they are as good to go. They are good to go.
Okay, let me take this thing about the mask, for instance, to the legislator. Mr. Anwar, This new proposed law, does it compel government, for instance, or would it compel government to make provisions for the citizens in a lockdown? To what extent?
Yes, a very important component of this bill is what, of course, some people have misunderstood: mandatory provision of certain things, which will include, for example, in this instance, something like masks. And I know governments, even at subnational levels, are making these provisions. You hear of states making orders. You even hear of National Assembly members making provisions for their constituents and all that. So I think it is something that this piece of legislation is also expected to cover: mandatory provisions in terms of outbreak. So to answer your question, yes, it is expected that this piece of legislation will provide for mandatory provision of certain things.
But to what extent will it compel government to provide for the people? To what quality of mask would the law, if it goes through, be compelling government to provide for the people?
Of course, the law may not be very specific as to the particular quality. But to also, the converse aspect of your question is the civic responsibility of citizens. You see, it is not comfortable to even wear masks. I came to this studio with mine, but you can see I had to put it aside because it's not even convenient. But it is it's a public health thing. The moment I live here, I'm expected to use it not just to protect myself, but to protect the public. So it's a duty we owe not just ourselves. It's not a duty to government. It is a duty to the public. And it's a constitutional thing. If you go to your Constitution, Section 24 talks about the civic duties of citizens. Citizens are expected, even when things are difficult, but because we need to, that is the essence of society. We don't just do things for our own, when it is convenient for us. We do it to protect also those who are members of the same society with us. So it's a duty. It's now going to be mandatory for government under this law to make these very necessary provisions for the good of the public. It's a component of public health legislation. So government will make these provisions at different levels, at the national level, at the subnational level, and all that and all that. But it is also going to be a duty on the citizens to mandatorily wear these masks, not just for their own protection, but for public protection.
Well, Dr. Sani, Cross River State is mass producing masks. They say they can make about 1 million a day. So any state who wants to buy a mask can actually order them from Cross River and tribute to the citizens. Well, I'm advertising your state for you.
Thank you for advertising.
Now, Dr. Funshaw, let's look at, as from Monday, with this easing, business concerns are expected to have hand sanitizers available and things like that. Maybe if not hand sanitizer, at least soap and water for people to wash their hands. How feasible do you think this will be?
Well, I think let me just talk about, not giving ourselves a huge task that will give us, nightmares. We wouldn't need up to 200 million cloth face masks in the first place, because a sizable proportion of our population are very young people and very old people. So those who will have to be in the streets are even less than half of that amount. Having said that, I mentioned earlier that when you get people's buy-in, they will afford 300 naira to protect themselves and their families. In other words, if I believe that I'm at risk, and by not wearing mask, I'm putting my family at risk, particularly if I have old people at home, 300 naira will not elude me to buy a mask. As far as provision by government is concerned, that is a very laudable thing. But as we know in this country, we still have not perfected the logistics of getting these kind of things to every individual who requires it. So I think the first thing is to get the public buy-in. And as the legislator said, let us now, based on that, realize that every member of the community has a civic responsibility to one another. In other words, wear these masks. The cloth mask will be the best thing in my view because it's non-disposable. It's not going to start littering our environment, because if we insist on these disposable masks, we'll find ourselves with millions and millions of masks after all of this is over, cluttering an environment and creating new problems. So cloth masks have been the thing we've used all the time in medicine. In theaters, that is what we use to ensure that we don't infect, patients' wounds when we open them up or we're dressing wounds. That is what we use. And we have had no complaints during those periods of time that they are, ineffective. They still remain effective for the purpose of ensuring that you do not spread any viruses that you may have. Therefore, if everybody wears a mask, then the amount of droplets that may contain the virus in our environment will be minimized. And in itself is a kind of control of spread. As we have said before, the virus has no legs except we carry it. It has no hands. And in the same fashion, if we make sure that we keep safe distances from one another and everyone wears a mask, then the chances of the virus being in large concentration in the air around us will be quite minimal. So essentially, masks are useful. The closed ones are effective. And as the doctor, on the program with me has said, if they're washed, if you can't iron them, disinfect them with bleach and dry them, or you wash them and iron them, they will last quite, a few weeks. And I believe everyone, can afford it whilst we're waiting for the huge amounts that needs to be invested in it by various governments at different levels.
Dr. Sani, the two other guests have talked about the people buying into this. Part of what the president said in his speech was that there's going to be a curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. every day. Do you think it will work? For a place like, for instance.
To be honest with you, I'll tell you it'll be tough. But like Dr. Funsho has mentioned, this is a question of just behavior change. If people are able to understand the why of what you're telling them to do, then it's easy for them to quickly adjust and adapt. After all, there was a total lockdown, you understand, which was even much more severe than an 8 to 6 curfew, you understand? So if now you do a lot of public enlightenment campaigns, you try and educate people to kind of like adapt and change their behavior for this period temporarily so that we can stop transmission, then we will have some mileage there. Yes.
Exactly. Mr. Enwo, one would have thought that instead of seeking to bring forth a bill to add to the other laws that Nigeria has that don't seem to be, or people will say that are not being enforced, one would have thought that the legislature will be looking to or to compel the National Orientation Agency to take up its responsibility of educating the people, because there have been complaints and questions out there. Where is the NOA in all of this?
I agree with you entirely that there is need for education, including even the bill we are proposing to bring up. It's at the core of compliance when people understand what it is all about. So I agree that NOA has a lot to do in terms of enlightening the people. If you talk about quarantine, if you talk about lockdown, if you talk about curfew, people will not comply if they don't understand what it means or the purpose for which it is intended. So I agree entirely with you. But that is not to say that we don't need a protocol on how to go ahead or carry out activities in the situation we have found ourselves. So yes, there is need for enlightenment, there is need for education, but then we still need a protocol. When you talk about quarantine, when you talk about curfew, when you talk about lockdown, these are things that are very important. But these are things you can't do unless there is a framework for it, which is the intent of this bill. So there is need for education, which is enlightenment through other agencies. These are other agencies. But we still need, very essentially, a framework, a toolkit, which a government can say,
the framework
this is how we
from
want to
somebody else.
This matter.
Can't we come up with a framework that is homegrown? Do we have to copy somebody else's framework that has worked in its territory? What about a framework that is homegrown, suitable to Nigerians and their peculiarities?
Thank you very much. Very important. Now, that is the essence of even this amendment. Like I told you, what we are trying to retool, to rekit, is a 1926 colonial contraption, which this country has suffered up till now. If you take time and go through this bill, what we have now tried to do is to increase the local content part of this bill, of this legislation, which we have had. So, yes, we need to make the law very relevant to our environment, and that is what we are trying to do. Now, I came across people talking about we took laws from other countries and all that and all that. That is global best practice. That is what every country is doing. In fact, what we are all the international community, what they are doing is following WHO protocol. And that is how the international system is. We are not expected to reinvent the wheel. We are expected to do things that have been tried probably elsewhere, and they have worked. That's how the international system works. So there's no way we will just wake up in our country now or as parliament and start drafting a completely new thing. We'll look at what is happening elsewhere. For instance, essentially we looked at what is happening, what Singapore has done. And we have seen that it is very, it's standard what they have done. And what we have done is to take what we can from it, add what we think is good for our own country as Nigeria. And that is what we are presenting to the Nigerian people. So that is how it operates at all times. Most bills, most conventions, in fact, the Constitution even empowers us, Section 12 of the Constitution empowers us to domesticate laws, sometimes verbatim. You see, the Child's Rights Act, for example. I have been advocating for us to domesticate the Kampala Convention, for example, as it concerns internally displaced persons. That's how the international system is. We can borrow what is happening in America or in the United Kingdom. They also borrow from other places. That's how the international system works. So, but most importantly, it has to be adapted to local circumstances. And that is essentially what this bill seeks to do.
Okay. Dr. Sani, let's look at social distancing. It's also one of the protocols recommended, which we are supposed to have been following up until. So it's not just that it's starting on Monday. Do you think that the people have a full understanding of that from what you see in the markets and places like that?
So it goes back to what I said before about behavior change. You know, habits die hard. Hitherto, before the advent of COVID-19, people have been living their lives, hugging each other, handshaking, doing all sorts of things, not social distancing, as it were. You know, and all of a sudden, we have this pandemic, and the guideline is you have to social distance. So it's difficult for people to quickly switch those habits and begin to do that. But one thing that helps in terms of trying to institute behavior change is for you to let people know the reason why. When people know why they are required to do that, you understand, it's easier for them to comply. For instance, awareness again, and then, you know, you take it from awareness to education, and then when it sinks in, people begin to now switch their behaviors. And that
In
takes
parentheses, do you
yes.
think that there is enough education going on, enough awareness being created for all this?
I doubt if it is. I doubt. A lot is happening, you know, in the media. You see a lot of things being posted, a lot of information, communication, and education materials are being put out there. But these are just telling you the guidelines. But people really need to know why. Why am I required to social distance, for instance? Basically, social distancing is all about physical distancing because, for instance, when it comes to the individual, they tell you don't touch your face, don't touch your mouth, don't touch your nose. Do you understand? So that is a first level aspect of that physical distancing. So even when it comes to the individual, you need to start observing that. Do you understand? So before you start to understand how to now social distance from other individuals, you get, so a lot of education, a lot of awareness needs to come to play for us to be able to get this to happen. You know, otherwise it will still be tough. People will hear it, but they will default back to their old ways. It's difficult. It's difficult, but it can be done.
Do you think they even understand it?
That's why.
Let's not talk about practicing it yet. Do they understand?
That is the point I'm trying to make. You know, that understanding has not yet been established. Otherwise, it will be easier. It will be easier. It will be easier to accomplish. It will be easier for people to comply. But then again, it's a question of behavior change. Like I said, habits die hard. They say it takes about 21 days for you to form a habit, and then it takes about another 90 days for you to change your lifestyle. You understand? This is what behavioral change research has proven. You know, so it takes time. So you need to keep laying it on and insisting and highlighting these things.
In the combat against poliomyelitis, thankfully Nigeria is one of those nations that's cleared out polio and all of that. When you spoke earlier, you talked about the resistance you got from the people bringing a vaccine to them. But then eventually we're now saying, okay, Nigeria is polio free. So what happened? How were you guys able to achieve that behavioral change that eventually led to the breakthrough? So the people are collecting the vaccines and now we can say we are polio free in Nigeria.
I think one very important tool that came to our aid was traditional leadership and religious leadership. The traditional leadership, particularly in the North, have a reach right down to the ward level. And there is respect, for traditional leadership. And that's the case, I'm sure, in every part of the country. And they haven't been convinced of the need to have polio vaccines.
Do apologize, Dr. Funshaw, but we've run out of time completely. It's just left for me to say thank you very much, Dr. Tunji Funshaw, physician and cardiologist, Honorable Igariwe Enwo, member House of Representatives representing Afikpo North-South, as well as Dr. Billy Usani, public health physician. Thank you all very much for coming to talk to us about this morning. Sunrise will be right back with another interesting conversation. Do stay with us.